I'm Guy Odishaw. I'm the second Sunday of the month, every other month, morning speaker, and I've been doing a series on non-dual awareness, and so this is a continuation in that series. So today, so every Sunday since I've started this particular series, the service has been around kind of getting some sense of the main teaching in the non-dual schools. And so the school that I usually talk about or give a name to is the Vedanta school, the Advaita Vedanta. There are other non-dual schools, but that's probably the one with the most name recognition, which most of you have not heard of. So they need better PR. So their primary teaching in the non-dual school is just stop. So one practice instruction, stop. But inevitably, the question of stop what? Stop what and how? Like, what does that mean? And so that's what we talk about on these Sundays is I try and give you a sense of the what, a way to get in touch with it, and then, again, the instruction, the invitation to stop doing that. A way to try and get familiar with and even practice the non-dual approach to self-understanding. So today, within that, we're going to look at this kind of constellation of things that we do that take us out of the non-dual and into the dual perspective. So these things that we're going to talk about today are identification and reification, so two technical terms, identification and reification. And then from within that, what happens is then a sense of relatedness, and that is in the form of desire or aversion. So attraction to something or repulsion from something. So we identify, we reify, and then we go into this whole elaborate complex of relatedness. And that's what occupies most of us all day long, is trying to navigate the politics of relationship. And whether that's with another person, or with your work, or with the meaning of life, or whatever it is, there's some sense of a you and an it and a relationship. And the non-dual schools would tell us that none of that is true, that whole constellation is an illusion. It is a case of mistaken identity. And so that's the instruction for today, is to stop doing that. Stop being identified, stop reifying, stop the politics. So all of that coming together. So I'm going to, as pointed out, I have props today, which is a somewhat unusual thing for me. I think it was last time we had the balloons, right? And space. So we talked about the continuity of space, the non-changeability of space as a metaphor for the non-dual perspective. So we're really going to work on the same thing today, only instead of balloons and space, it's going to be glasses and water. But it's really the same thing that I'm pointing to. But in that, we're also going to talk about this process of identification and reification. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about those two things so you have a sense of it in your mind as I go on. I think identification is pretty easy, right? Identification is just that you, in any moment, take yourself to be someone or something. Right? And so the I sense, right? That inside of you, there is perpetually an I sense, whether you are knowing it in a moment. So in other words, it's explicit. Like if I say, well, I feel this way, there's an I reference, and the I is explicit. Or I'm just having some reaction to something, and I'm not really thinking about or naming the I in the midst of it, but it's clearly there's an I there having a reaction to something. and a whole constellation of feelings of I like it or I don't like it. So that's identification, right? And whether that identification is with your body, or with your name, or with your position in your family, or your work, or your position in a marriage, like a marriage relationship, or position in the world, inside your own mind, in your own kind of, inner dialogue, there's a you in there. There's always like some I sense. Yeah? So that's identification. Pretty simple. Reification, this can be sometimes a little more challenging. So reifying is something that the mind does when it conceptualizes something. So the mind likes to kind of take something that exists in reality and put parameters around it, kind of like put it in a bubble and say that this is a something. This is a something different than this thing over here that I put another bubble around, right, and separates them. And it's just an aspect of mind. It's something that it does, and it's helpful, right? But we get a little carried away with it, and we forget that it is just a helpful way to relate to reality, and we start to take it as how reality is. So this process of reifying, where we take reality and we break it into bits, and then we think of those bits as actually separate. That's reification. So this is what the mind is always up to. It's identified, and then it's going around reifying and taking that to be the case, and then living in relationship with what it itself just did to reality. It takes that to be true about reality and lives in relationship to it, and that's the thing we want to take a look at, try and get a sense of how are you doing it, and then kind of contemplate what would it be like to stop doing that. So, I'm going to go to my example here. Let's see how this goes. So I was saying earlier, I've only done this once before, kind of in a demonstration, and that was on radio. So you have to imagine how a visual experiment went on radio. It wasn't necessarily the best idea. So what I want to take you through here is some of the ways our mind kind of works, and philosophically there are different schools of thought that we could think about, and so if I say kind of a reductionist or a materialist perspective, some of you might be like, yeah, I've heard of that. We often think of science as being reductionist and reducing everything down to physics or chemistry, kind of the smallest functional bits, and then they say that that's all that exists, and everything is just, what do they call it, frisky dirt, right? Is the saying. So we can go from the materialist camp, where there's just physical reality and nothing else, and we kind of move through the spectrum up to the non-dual perspective. And so we're just going to take kind of a wander through that, stopping at certain points, and really this is, for you to kind of see, as I'm going, where does your mind start to agree? Like in the first, it might be like, yeah, no, I know people who think that way, and they're just silly. And then at some point, you're like, yeah, that's how it is. That's how the world is. And then I'll go beyond that and be like, now you've gone back into fantasy guy. You were 2 steps back, you were right on, but now this is just, religion. And, we all know that's not real. So through the exercise, you just want to kind of see, where does your mind do that? It just tells you something about you. And since all of this is really only about you, that's all that matters, right? Is what you learn about yourself in this, that's what matters. So some of the traditions would tell us, certainly if we say, kind of draw on the Christian tradition, this idea of in spirito, right? Being inspired, the inspiriting of the body, right? So This idea that the Holy Spirit enters the body, the divine enters the body. The body is animated by the Spirit, right? So we have that idea, right, where we have a vessel that is inspired, and there we go. We have a body. And then, depends, you might say, like, if we're a reductionist, we might say there is a mind, but the mind is really just the brain, which is a part of the body. So the mind is just a different way of relating to the body, but it's still just the body. But we'll give it a separate category because it seems like it has a separate category. And then, staying in that same camp, they might have the idea of a soul. They would say, well, there's not really a soul, but because you think you have a mind, your mind thinks that it has a soul. And the mind is an epiphenomena of the brain, and the brain is somehow got this mistaken idea that it has a soul. So really, there's just a body and something like a mind and something like a soul, but those are just ideas that exist in the body, right? So that's the reductionist perspective. So if we move away from that and get a little bit more, let's just say away from that, we may accept the idea of mind, and that mind is its own thing. It is not just an epiphenomena of the brain. It exists in and of itself. So the mind is its own kind of dimension of reality. So we have a body and we have a mind. Okay? So that takes us beyond mere physical reduction and takes us into what we might call beyond the gross to the psychic, right? And allowing the psychic level of existence to be real. So then we go to soul, or something like soul, right? Something beyond mind that is different than mind, distinct from mind, is its own dimension. And so you can imagine, I'm sure you're familiar with the philosophies and traditions that kind of allow for that, and they make space, and it separates them out from the traditions that say no. So if you have your biologists who believe in biology and the physical world, and then you have your psychologists who believe in the mind, right? And then maybe we have our religious folks who that's our traditional kind of area or domain for those who believe in the soul, right? So we've got these philosophies, right? And so what happens, though, is relative to us today, and what we're talking about identification and reification, is we think that these are three separate things, right? There's a body, a mind, and a soul, and they're three separate things. And we talk about, right, for example, in healthcare today, we're actually past the trend, but to talk about the body-mind connection, right? So to even think that, the body-mind connection, implicit in there is the idea that they're not the same, that they're separate, and then somehow we have to figure out how they're connected, right? And we've been through this the last several decades, lots of ahas of seeing the research on meditation saying you meditate and it affects your body, and oh my goodness, the mind has impact on the body. This is an astounding revelation, right? So this to them is the proof of relatedness. Okay? So then for those, again, who are perhaps a little more progressive, we look at body, mind, spirit, right? Again, thinking that they're separate and they must be related. So we're searching for how are they related? How is spirit related to mind? How is spirit related to body? And you have all kinds of body, mind, spirit traditions where people want to help you get these three separate parts of you in touch. Right? We could probably step out here and find several flyers that will talk to us about opportunities to go to workshops where we can learn about how to relate our body, our mind, and our spirit. So that's another in our level of understanding as we go along, right? So it's pretty progressive in that it's allowing those three domains, but it's still relating to them as if they're separate and need to be integrated somehow. We need to understand the nature of their relationship. So if we go a little further, right? So in my little demonstration here, this represents reality. So I could not get an Earth-sized, universe-sized pool of water to work with. So this is where you have to use your imagination a little bit, and this represents all of reality. Okay. So a more progressive approach would be to say, so you may be familiar with this in the Greek philosophy. They would refer to this, the water as the ether, or in the Hindu tradition, yoga tradition, they refer to it as the akasha, right? So that there's this idea that there is some other substance that is beyond body, mind, and soul. There's some other substance that these inhere in, right? That they're within this other substance. Sometimes that's called God, or not, depends on the tradition that you come from. But again, in a kind of progressive sense, this is usually the next progression, which is to say that there's these three and they exist within this oneness, right? So there's a oneness that these exist within. So, in some sense, getting better, right? So now if we look at this, we could say, well, I don't know if you guys can tell from where you are, but the water is above the level of the vessels. Right? So we could say, right, that there's water in them, right? But it's all the same water. Right? The water is continuous. Right? Does that kind of make sense? Your mind can see that and doesn't grapple too hard against it, right? So this is getting closer, right? This is getting closer to the edge between kind of the dual perspective and the non-dual perspective. Right? We're getting closer, but still, the non-dual school would say that you haven't gone far enough. You haven't solved it yet by just saying there's this thing called akasha or ether, and that ether is every place, and the ether is also inside the body. It is inside the mind, and it is inside the soul. It's what constitutes the body, it's what constitutes the mind, and it's what constitutes the soul. Right? But we're closer. So just want you to kind of take a mental snapshot of that and kind of internalize the sense of that. Right? So, okay. Can you still relate to the body in here? To the mind? To the soul? Yeah? You still have a sense that the water that was in the body is in here, right? Okay. Do you have a sense of how the water that was in the body, just using that as an example, you could say the mind or the soul the same way. So the water that was in the body, how that is now kind of in relationship to the rest of the water. Can you get a sense of that? I see some nodding and then a lot of just dead stares, which I'm not sure how to interpret the dead stares, which is... So here's what I want to say, right? So that is a trick of the mind, right? So that's the process of reification that your mind just did. Right? When I asked you the question of, can you get a sense of the relatedness between the water that was the body and the rest of the water? And you say, yeah, I can, right? It doesn't actually exist, right? There is no relationship between the water that was in the vase and the water that's in the pan, right? Because it's just all water now, right? There's no difference. The only difference exists in your mind because it was in something and I took water from one thing and I poured it into another thing, and your mind kind of still holds them apart as if they're really separate. But they're not, right? You can never get out of here the same water that was in that vase. Does everybody agree? Is there anybody who thinks you could actually get the water that was in the vase, the same water, back into the vase again?
What if water inside the glass is the same as outside, the salted water? And when you remove glass, it's different.
But was that the case?
Well,
so that's, again, there's the mind trying to find a way to make what it believes true. So it's just good to notice that. That's what mind does. Perfect. Mind should do that. Our goal is to stop believing in that, right? So the question being, right, is you can't. But again, if there's somebody here that believes that you can, I want to hear from you, right? So I had a student for many years who we would argue regularly. She said that that was possible, like absolutely possible to do. No matter what I said, no matter what I sent her off to read or look at, to study, years she was convinced that absolutely you could have that same water back again. It exists in there in a separate way, right? Which I totally appreciate, right? Because that's what we have in our different religions and our philosophies. We have that, just a rigid dedication to a belief that even in the absence of any evidence to support it, that's what it believes. That's the process of identification and reification. That's what it does, right? That's it operating. So it's just good to see that and respect it for what it is. And then, as the different schools of self-understanding would say, is go to work on that mechanism itself. Don't try and change your mind. Don't try and change somebody else's mind. Right? Transcend the mind. Right? Transcend this capacity, this function, this thing that the mind does that we take to be real. Just see its unreality. Don't try and change the mind with bigger ideas, better ideas, more progressive ideas. Right? It's a fine thing to do, right? That's a hobby, but that should not be a practice. Right? Because the mind and this thing that it does of identification and reification, that's the problem. Not the content of that mind, but that's how that mind functions. So we might have to transcend the function. Right? So, this is what the non-dual school would say, right? Is the case, that this is reality, that reality is just all one, right? And that our mind projects into it these different structures, right? That there's a body and a mind and a soul, and it projects those into it and then begins breaking up the separateness and building relatedness. Right? So to ask the same question but in a different way, I could say, how is this bit of the water here, how's this bit over here, related to this bit of water over here? I can ask the question, right? And you can hear the question. Your mind is probably like, oh, that's a really good question, guy. And you can probably imagine, like, there's this bit of water over here, and then there's this bit of water over here, but hopefully at this point you realize, like, that's a trick question, right? That there is no relationship because it's not different. It's continuous. It's all one. It's just water, right? Without parts. Right? Seem clear? Okay, great. Let's do a couple of questions, some exercises, to try and see how this is for you. Where are you doing this in your own perspective, your own relationship to reality? So, Those of you who've done this before, you probably know what's coming next. If you have something to write on, this is a great time to write this down. If you don't worry about it. I will give you the questions again. Perhaps you can be strategic and partner up with somebody who did write it down so you have them. And it's not necessary, but it is stress reducing. So we're going to do two questions today. The second one's going to be a little bit different, so I'll give you a description of both, but most of you will be familiar with the first one, which is just a repeating question. And that is tell me a way you are reifying now. Tell me a way you are reifying now. So I'll give you a little reminder, reifying. Reifying? R-E-I-F-I-Y-I-N-G. Reifying. So to reify is to take the mind, one of its things that the mind does is called discrimination. It breaks our experience up into and smaller bits. The more we focus the mind in on something, the more we break it up into pieces, right? And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that. It's helpful, right? But reification is like a bonus thing that the mind does with that, right? It breaks it into pieces, but then takes those pieces to actually be separate individual pieces, separate from that which it was just discriminated out of. Right? So it encapsulates reality and then thinks that encapsulation is the way that it is. Right? So that's reifying. Right? So you could say the mind is always separating. It's separating things out. There is a wholeness, and mind comes along and starts pulling it into separate pieces. Right? So tell me a way you are reifying now. So what you want to try and do in the question is try and catch yourself doing it. Can you, in the moment, see yourself doing it? Can you see this function of your being functioning? So that's the, yes.
So I'm sorry, when you said reify and encapsulates reality and believes it to be true?
To be separate. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first question, repeating question. You're going to do 2 minutes each side, so one person will ask for 2 minutes, then the other person will ask for 2 minutes. And do your best to ask the question, kind of as given, the same each time. Right? And for the person answering, I encourage you to just take this in a form of kind of free association. Let the question land on you, and then an answer comes. Without trying to be strategic or without trying to get it right or anything of that nature, to sense your body, be in touch with your emotional self, your mental self, your energetic self, however many layers of self you feel you can be in touch with, so that your answer can come from any dimension of your being. It doesn't have to come from your analytic verbal mind. That might be the one who puts it into words to give an answer, but the answer doesn't have to come from there. The answer could come from any place. So it's a willingness to be surprised by what comes up. So that's the repeating question. One person asks, same question for 2 minutes. The other person answers it. And we reverse roles, I'll watch the time. So that's the first question. Second question. This is the one that's a little bit different. So I'll give you the question first and then just kind of describe how the exercise goes. Your ideas of separateness and relatedness are as real as the footprints of a bird in the sky. Your ideas of separateness and relatedness are as real as the footprints of a bird in the sky. Yes. What's that? I'm going to give you the exercise that goes with the question. So first the question, let your mind kind of be rattled by that. So I figure if I give you the instructions and then the question, you'll forget the instructions. Right? So this is along the lines of a classic koan. Right? So Zen Buddhism is based on the koan, to give the mind the unanswerable question and then put the mind to the task of answering it. And because it's an unanswerable question, eventually the mind is exhausted and gives up and lays down. Right? And that it's in that moment that you transcend the mind. Right? So this is in the flavor of the Zen koan, right? The unanswerable question. So for those of you who have done these before, if I say you're going to do a monologue, which is kind of a stream of consciousness on a topic, you just kind of go with what's arising and you just have a period of time and you just inquire into that which is arising in the container of the question given. So the question is the container. You inquire into the form and texture of mind that inquiry brings up, that question brings to you. Right? Then you do your inquiry within the container of that question. So here, you may take a moment and do, a bit of a contemplation. Right? So koans are usually contemplated. It's a silent internal process. So through your time, you may start with just a moment of silence and reflect on this question and just see what does it do to your mind, right, as you contemplate it. And then verbalize that. You may talk for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever, 10 seconds. But then allow yourself to lapse back into a moment of silence and contemplation again, and let the question work on you. And then whatever that is, bring that back into, put words to it, verbalize it. So it is part monologue, right? Part stream of consciousness, part contemplation. Again, what you're looking for is not so much an answer to the question, although if that's where your mind goes, that's fine. What you're wanting to see, to notice, and articulate is the impact of it on you. How's it affecting you? That's more the direction you want to go. But as always, the for sure thing that you want to be with is what is happening. So if you're feeling anxious and the sense of it arising is that I'm a wingnut, I don't know what I'm talking about, I don't know why I came here today, I'm not coming back again. As a matter of fact, I think I might try and slip out right now while nobody's noticing. If that's what's coming up, then that's your answer, right? Because you're being present to what's arising in you in the moment. That's the real magic. That's the alchemy of this kind of exercise, is being present to yourself as you're arising. The questions are just an opportunity to do that. Okay? So, we're going to do a repeating question, 2 minutes aside. Then we'll do the contemplation, and you'll have, we'll do 3 minutes. Right? Again, I'll monitor time, so I'll start you, I'll stop you, so you don't have to worry about that. Ready?
The contemplation, and one person reads it out loud, like I read it out loud and then I contemplate it, or I read it for someone else?
Sure. So, this is not like the repeating question where you're asking. So you've got your notes and whatever's in your mind about this question, and then you're just doing a kind of stream of consciousness related to that. Yeah. Good question. So, grab a partner, turn face, sit at a social, comfortable distance from each other so you can allow yourself to do this inquiry around. So this is from one of my favorite books. It's called Eleutherios, the Liberator. tiny little book, long out of print. If you ever have an opportunity to find one, I highly recommend buy it. It is written by an American, by a Western adept, and so it is the non-dual truth communicated in a very succinct, direct way, but from a Western mind, and so our minds take it in a little more easily because the language that used is native to our mind versus when we read a translation of a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Sikh or you name it. If we're reading the translation, something gets lost. But what I love about this is its precision. I'm going to read one of my favorite quotes from this book. The body-mind is what you call I. Consciousness, as the body-mind, is Narcissus, the separate and separative ego, identical to experience. In the state of identification with the body-mind, consciousness is a subject suffering from the absurd presumption that it is identical to its own object. So there's a summary in prose form of exactly what we talked about today. In the state of identification with the body-mind, consciousness is a subject suffering from the absurd presumption that it is identical to its own object. There's another koan for you. So thank you for coming this morning. I'm here every other month on the second Sunday of the month. So if you could follow that, it would be delightful to see you again next time.